So once the system options are defined, right, the next option or the next task we need to configure in the application is going to be a expense report templates. So whenever we want to enter the expense into the expense module, right, we need to have the list of expense types which employees can select based on the nature of their expenses they have incurred, right. Using that expense type, they can enter the expenses into the application, and also the corporate policies which will be linked to these expense types, right, and to categories, right, that can also be enforced to different categories as well as the expense types. So to have these all types grouped under one template, right, we configure the expense report template. So basically template is like, it's just the grouping of all different type of expenses into one template so that employees can uh, select a particular expense type and submit their expenses. Right. So basically, this slide explains you the expense report template concept. Right. So what is the expense report template? What is expense type? And what is expense item? Right. So expense report template is basically, as I mentioned, it's a grouping of all related expense types that can be defined for a specific business unit. Right. So it could be your travel expenses, education, your meals, your hotel expenses, right, your car rental. These are different examples of expense type. So based on this, let's say employee goes on trip, right, he is going to book the, let's say, air ticket expense, hotel booking, meals, entertainment expense, right. So this will be expense types. And there's expense item. So what happens is, when an employee goes and create expense report, he's going to create expense items. So let's say he can just create one expense report and he can have multiple expense items within that report which represents different type of expenses, right. So from the Oracle term, it is called the expense items, right, or you can call it expense lines basically. So within the expense report you have expense items or lines. Now when we have to define the expense report template, right, so we should consider some of the points. So these are the points which will be key determinant factors when we need to decide how many templates to be created, right? So it's normally what happens is this expense report templates are defined at the business unit level. So the first and foremost, we have to decide how many business units we have. Okay? So the number of business units we have, the same number of expense report templates we need to configure. Then we need to decide what kind of expense report templates we want, right? So whether we just need one expense template or we need to create more than one. So for example, let's say we can create one template for all the travel related expenses. Then we can create one template for all our, let's say, general and admin expenses. Because as a workaround, you can use expense module for this purpose as well, right? So let's say you have some specific coordinators, or let's say petty cashiers in your organization. They incur different expenses from their petty cash balance or the float, and what they can do is they can use the expense module to submit all those expenses. Ultimately it will get transferred to the payables module. All your expenses get recorded, and that petty cashiers will get reimbursed for the same amount what he has incurred, right? So one example of deciding the number of expense report templates we want, right? So the next, do you need multiple expense report templates, right? So it depends on the organization policy basically, if you want to capture everything under one template or you want to segregate it. Again, it depends on the number of business units and the number of languages we have. So for example, if we have all the business units operating let's say within one language, then you can have a common template. Otherwise you have to configure different templates in different languages as well. Then what type of expense categories you want to use, right? So as I mentioned, there are specific categories given by the Oracle. right? So it could be airfare, accommodation, per diem, then your meals, mileage, right? So these are the categories. So what type of categories you want to use, whether you want to segregate it, these categories in different templates, or you want to combine them all in one particular template, right? So this is again a key factor. What expense types are required within the categories? So let's say we take one category, airfare. What type of expense type you want? You want airfare, right? So you want domestic, let's say international, then let's say based on the flight class, business, economy, and all of this, right? So what type of expense type you want to go in detail, right? You can also decide that. Then what is your receipt requirement basically? So let's say for particular expenses, do you want receipts to be attached mandatorily, or even if it is not attached, let's say employees are required to submit the hard copies, the physical documents on a regular basis, right? So again, this also decides the templates creation. So whether you want a common template or different templates. And there's also a very key concept available in the expense module called itemization, right? So let's say an employee goes on trip, right? So uh, he may incur some expenses related to the business, right? So it could be travel, accommodation, and let's say conveyance and all of this, right? These are, let's say, all related to business purpose. Then there will be some expenses incurred for entertainment, let's say for his personal usage, right? So for example, let's say he's bringing his family members, right? So for which he is not eligible to claim, right? So using the itemization, we can segregate the expenses into business expense and personal expenses, right? So this itemization requirement also decides the template basically. So these are the key factors we should consider before we go for expense report template creation. Now, there's also concept of default expense report template. So what happens, as I mentioned, these templates are defined at the BU level. So each business unit can have only one default expense template. Right? So each business unit can have multiple templates created, but out of those, only one can be defined as a default. Right? So this also needs to be considered, right? So you can decide which template you want to default. So what happens is whenever employee log in into application and goes to expenses, he will have the list of templates, but what happens is by default he will see one template already selected based on the default option setup. And the key point in the entire expense report template discussion is that you cannot share the expense report template across the business units. So I already mentioned that it is specific to the business unit. So if you have more than one business unit, the same number of expense report template needs to be created. And this is one of the mandatory tasks we need to configure, without which we cannot enter the expenses into the application, right? So let's go back to the application, right? And we'll see how this can be configured. So I can search for the expense template, and if any of you are just new to the Oracle application, right? So basically you can also you can just put a keyword and then you can use the percentage sign in order to get the all the related results, right? So you can see here I just mentioned exp percentage temp TMP, right? So I can get all the related search results, and then we can select the task we want to use. So now I can click on manage expense report template, right? So you can see here there are n number of templates already created for different business units here, right? You can see all of them, and you can see the default template. So this is what I was discussing, right? You can mark one of the template under the same business unit as default template. So whenever employee tries to enter the expense, this particular template will get defaulted. Then obviously if there is more than one template available, employees can change it. They can select another template if they want. And again, these templates, as we can see here, it is linked to the business unit, right? So employees will be able to see only those templates to which they are authorized. So for example, let's say there is one employee who is hired under the US1 business unit. So he will be able to see templates only which are created for the US1 business unit BU. They cannot see any other healthcare US business unit or US1 business unit, or sorry, any other US business unit, right? So this is by default, this security is in place based on the business unit on which you are hired. So let me create a new template, right? So we'll click on the plus button. First of all, we need to give the name. Excuse me. So I'm going to give the name Progress UK business unit template, right? So I'll just say Progress UK template. So description is not mandatory. If you want, you can put the description about this. And then we have to select the business unit. Right. So I'm going to select the UK business unit, and we can put the effective start date. So you can also go back. You can put the previous date also in past. Right. Now this is the header information we have entered. Then we have these various tabs available. So first of all, we are going to define the expense types. Right. So I will click on the create button here. So we are creating expense type within the template. So first we created template. Under the template, now I'm going to create various types. So let's say airfare, right? And here you can select the category. So these are the standard category provided by Oracle. So you can select specific category. If it doesn't fit in any of this category, you can select the miscellaneous. Right. So I will go for airfare first. Right. Then we have the text classification code. So if you want to default the text percentage to this particular expense type, right, you can select it here. So when employee selects this type, airfare, automatically text classification code will get defaulted. You can put the effective start date for this type, and we need to provide the natural account for this. I'm going to select the airfare expense account. Okay, so the account is also assigned, right? So now I can just save this record. Now for this particular expense type, we can decide these additional options, right? So first we have the itemization, right? So you can enable any particular expense type for the itemization, right? Whether it is required or not. So if you enable it, so this option is this expense type used in itemization only. So what happens is this will be available only in case employee needs to do the itemization. In other scenarios, it is not going to be available, right? Then we have the project expenditure type mapping. So again, if your organization is using the project module, right, PPM module, then you can enable this particular expenses for the project use. Right? So what happens is whenever employee enters the expenses, he will be able to select the project number and the task name or the task number. And here, as a part of setup, what we are doing is we are mapping it to the expenditure type. So each project will have its own list of tasks and everything, and expenditure types are also configured in the system. So that list of expenditure type will be available here. So what happens? Employee submits the expenses. He selects the particular project number, task number. So that information comes from the expense report, and the expenditure type information comes from the this mapping here what we are providing, right? So default project expenditure type, and the expenditure organization, it will be selected based on the business unit in which that employee is hired or he is entering the expenses. Now, so this is just a default one, right? Then you can further give it for each different project unit. If you have different expenditure types, you can give further mapping here by project unit. So in case you have more than one project unit and you want to assign different project expenditure type, you can do it here. Otherwise, system is going to consider the default one. Next we have is receipt requirement, right? So receipt requirement basically whether employees need to attach receipts, whether it's mandatory, optional, what are the options or restrictions you want to put. You can decide it here. Require receipts for cash expense lines, right? So use setup from the expense template. So this receipt requirement also, there are different layers, right? So the lowest layer is from the expense type. If it is not, let's say it is mentioned here, not required. So that means when I am entering any expenses, I am not required to put attach the receipts. It is not mandatory, it is optional. If I am referring it to the expense template, so this is one layer ahead, right? So what happens is system is going to first check the option setup at the type, expense type. If it is not set up here, then it is going to check at the template level. And if it is not at the template level, then it is going to check the policies. So these are the three different levels at which you can configure this option, right? Or you can also define the amount above which employee is required to do the receipt attachment. So I'm going to say, let's say I am defining here 1 GBP, right? So that means whenever employee submits expense related to airfare and the amount is more than 1 GBP, they have to attach the receipt document to that expenses. Require receipts for corporate card expense lines. So if there are corporate card expenses, right? So the same options you can define for the corporate card as well. Apply receipt requirement rules to negative expense lines, right? So if they are entering anything, any expenses in negative, right? So there should also be applied, this rule should also be applied or not, you can decide it here. Do you want to display the receipt missing policy warning to user, right? So this means user, if they don't attach the receipt, right, they will get a warning, right? So they can also get a warning message. So in case they forget to attach the document, this warning will help them remind on attaching the receipt document. Then we have the tab for policies. Right? So in the tomorrow session, we are going to go through the policies in detail. Right? So there are various type of policies which we can configure in the application. And once the policies are configured, it needs to be attached here at the expense type level. So you can just simply select here policy. Right? Similarly, you can attach the attendees policies and preferred agencies details also. Last, we can decide expense fields. So there are certain expense fields which you can configure at the expense type level, whether you want to display it, you want to keep it optional or mandatory. Right? So for example, description. So whether employee is required to put description, right? So whether that field should be, first of all, it should be visible or not. So you can either select hidden or you can mark it as optional. But if you want them to compulsorily enter the description, you can mark it as a required as well. So that means they have to write something in the description without which they cannot submit the expense report. Then next is expense location. So again, this depends on the expense type, because certain expense type will have the corporate policy attached to it, and that policy itself requires, let's say, location details in order to decide the rate applicable, or whether eligibility criteria, whether employees are eligible to claim this particular expense or not, right? So if in that way, if it is required, location information is required, you can select it here, whether it's required, optional, or hidden. So let me select optional. And merchant name. So if employees are submitting any expenses, right? So whether they should put the merchant name as a information or not, right? So again, hidden, optional, or required, right? So I would say optional. So once this information is entered, you can save and close it. Right? So you can see one type. This is our template. Within that template, we created the expense type. Now again, we are going to create another one, right? So again, I'm going to put the name here. So let's say hotel expense, right? So I can select category as accommodation, right? Again, text classification code if you want to put, enter the start date, and attach the natural account here. So this is the account which will get debited when these expenses are transferred to the payables module. So in payables, invoice will be created, and the line level distribution code combination will come from this information. So the natural account comes from the expense type, whatever account you select here, and the rest of the segments by default it comes from the default expense account setup at the HR level. So at the employee record, master record, whatever default expense account is set up, all the rest of segments will come from there, and the natural segment will come from expense type. So I'm going to select the hotel accommodation natural account, and again we can put the same information for all of this, right? We can set up the receipt requirement, policies. Now let's say your receipt requirement is consistent across all the expense type, then you can simply you can set it up at the template level. So instead of doing it individually at each and every expense type, if it is consistent, like you have the same policy across all the expense types or categories, you can do it at the template level also. So it's easy, right? It's just one time you have to do the setup, and system can follow it. Now policies, again it will be different for each expense type, so you have to do it at the expense type level only, and fields can also be specific to the expense type. So for that reason, it is given at the expense type level also, and it is given at the template level also. So we can decide at what level we want to set it up. So once it is done, you can save and close and create one more. Let's say meals, right? So I can select category as meal, and we can also have the start date and select the account. Let me just select any random account in that case. So I'm just selecting a random account for now, right? And save and close. So as we were discussing, right, these expense fields, receipt requirement, these are given at the template level also. So this is the template level options. So if you have common options across all the expense types, you can do it at the template level also. So the same, you can just put the receipt requirement limit amount here, and then for the corporate card also, same, you can define the limit above which receipt attachment is mandatory. Do you want to apply the receipt requirement rules to the negative expense line also? Right? Allow users to indicate that receipts are missing. So what happens is, if let's say employees genuinely don't have the receipts with them, either they lost it or it's misplaced or it is torn up or whatever it is, right? So they can notify it. There will be a checkbox available on the expense report that missing receipts, so they can notify to their managers or auditors that receipts is not available with them, right? So then the auditor and manager, they can decide whether it should be reimbursed or not based on the policies. So if again, it can depend on the amount also. If it's a nominal small amount, they can also approve it and it will get reimbursed. If there is a significant amount, they can reject it as well. So again, it's a corporate decision or the manager's decision. And do you want to display the missing receipt warning to the users, right? So in case the receipts are not attached and an employee is trying to submit the expense report, should they get the warning message that the receipt is not attached, right? So you can set that option. Similarly, you can also set up the expense fields as well. So description, expense locations. So description, let's say it should be required, expense location optional, number of days, right? So you can say optional, and merchant name, again optional. So what happens is, optional means these fields will be listed there on the expense report, but you can either enter the information or you can leave it blank. It is not mandatory. It will allow you to proceed without this information as well. But wherever we set required, that means you have to enter some information in that field. So now you can also mark this particular template as a default template, right? And then save and close it. So this is just a general warning: corporate card mapping isn't set up. In case you are using the corporate card as well, then that additional mapping needs to be done. Without this mapping, you won't be able to enter the corporate card transactions, right? So okay, so now our template is created. You can see here, Progress UK expense template. It's now available. So this is how we can do the expense template creation. Now again, as we already discussed, there are a number of points or the criteria you need to decide on which the number of templates you require, whether you want only one template or you need to create multiple templates. Right? So once this is decided, you can create your templates from this particular task.